Good morning and welcome to the short support webinar on design distribution obligations. Look, I'm sure people will dial in as they turn up, and the nature of these types of things is people dial in late, but there's no reason why we should delay things longer than we already have. What I've done is change the settings so that everyone who's participating on this call can actually ask questions as we go, so you're able to speak. So you're in control of your own mute function. So if you do have questions when we go through this, I encourage you to ask them as we go. Alternatively, use the chat function and send them in. But welcome. The design distribution obligations, when they came in, let's take a step back before they came in, because we've been talking about design distribution obligations since about 2017, give or take. And it sort of rode the wave of product failures and consumer antipathy towards financial services. So we saw a whole range of issues. So back in 2017 or so, that they started talking about making a more consumer-centric way of distributing and representing products. Now, what we're talking about today is the act that gives practical effect to those intentions and how it works in practice, because there's been a lot of misinformation about design and distribution obligations and how they fit together. So I want to try to run through that in as practical a way as we can today, and without necessarily going over topics we've already addressed previously. We did have a separate introductory session on design and distribution obligations, the old DDO or D&D. I don't want to duplicate that today if I can avoid it. I want to really talk about the practical aspects and how it fits in, and also deal with the issues that we're seeing from our client base. And that's what we're covering off today. So with that said, let's get into it and just try to figure out what we're talking about and what we're dealing with. And again, even when we get to the practical scenarios as well, we're going to run through some practical examples of how this works, with drawing from our client base as well. You might have seen when we put out a note this morning in 3 Hit Tuesday, one of the issues we were dealing with was DDO in terms of intra-fund advice and how that works. Now, there's going to be a lot of teething issues over time when you look at the specific exemptions that are available under the DDO and how it works and how this flows through into the advice process and the way in which the advice process can modify the application of the law, right? Because if you're providing personal advice, you've got a general exemption from a lot of the obligations under the Ddo Regime. But if you're only providing general advice, then you've got broader obligations. So again, it depends on the precise nature of the advice you're giving and how your business is structured. So when we go through this, we'll be looking at it from the issuer's perspective, of course, in terms of what they need to do, because their choices impact each one of us. They certainly impact you on a day-to-day basis. And we can see that in terms of not just the way the TMDs are structured and distributed, but also some of the interesting little things that the issuers are putting into their contracts with the distribution agreements in terms of your obligations and how that fits together. So we'll be drawing on that. We're drawing on some really practical experience that we've got over the past 6 weeks or so as this regime has kicked in. And I just want to remind you that the design and distribution obligation is only one part of a broader series of reforms that we're dealing with. You know, breach reporting, complaints, design distribution hawking, changes to risk advice, the new misconduct regime, the whole series of things, all of which kicked in October. Now, the significance and the profound structural changes that were affected by these Red October reforms are not lost on ASIC. They understand that there is an impact here, that people and businesses are going to have to make some significant changes in order to be able to deal with some of these changes. So ASIC have announced that they will take a facilitative approach. What that means is that, you know, they will react proportionately but reasonably if licensees and advisors are taking reasonable steps to comply with the obligations. So if they've been ignoring them and just hoping they go away, well, ASIC won't exercise the discretion. But in the event that they identify an issue in your business in terms of the way in which you're processing these obligations, implementing them, or if you've approached it with the right intent and made more than reasonable efforts to try to do the right thing, then the consequences are going to be far less severe than if they take the view that you really haven't made much of an effort. Okay, so we want to go through today as to what those efforts would look like in a business, in an advice business like yours, and the additional steps you should take or consider taking in order to make that happen and to minimise that regulatory risk. At the heart of this, and it's hard to avoid when you look at the DDO, but particularly when you look at complaints and breaches, is that there should be an observation or a recognition in the back of your mind about, the additional data you're now sending to the regulator, or you're sending to the regulator via product issuers and other sources. When we look at complaints, breaches and DDO obligations, is that there is going to be this almost, I won't say a tsunami because it's going to be regular, isn't it? This regular flow of information from regulated parties to the regulator. And the regulator will use that information in order to tailor the way in which they approach regulation and the way in which they intervene in the market. So we have to accept that. And part of that means at a business level, we need to ensure that we've got measures, processes and procedures in place to be able to manage these issues and collect the data that we need. And also at a practical business level, to be able to respond internally to what that data and what those data signals are. So it's a really big shift, almost a quantum leap for a lot of advice businesses about moving from, just concentrating on being able to produce and document the advice to also being able to look at the underlying issues that go with running an advice business, including the regulatory expectations for reporting. So again, this is something we have to deal with at a practical level. And it really is central to the DDO regime. So what is a DDO regime without going through and repeating everything we've talked about before is like, I've always thought that the DDO, when I started talking about it in 2017, I thought it was going to be one of more significant reforms of the financial services regulatory regime. I'm a bit disappointed that it isn't. It's, in my view, it's really come across as more of a bureaucratic exercise. And I know people providing personal advice to retail clients are essentially exempted from a lot of these obligations, but there's a bit of devil in the detail. And I also notice there's a degree of overcomplication that's being driven by some of the parties in the industry, particularly the institutional licensees and the platform providers, and an increased level of complexity as well. So we see that when we look at the reporting that some of the product issuers are requiring from you and to how they should fit together. So again, as we go through, we'll deal with that type of stuff. At a high level, these reforms were just meant to be, I guess, the coverall for the design, issue and distribution of financial products, because we know if we look back historically, you have to go back too far, you have to go back as far as West Point, you can look at Mayfair 101 more recently, or a whole range of other products that have fallen over and caused consumer losses and a lack of consumer confidence in the market. So this regime was attempting to address all that, and you can't have a regulatory change without the introduction of new penalties and new enforcement. And one of those elements was the product intervention panel, which gives ASIC the ability to be able to intervene directly into the market where they see there's a problem or a potential problem associated with the product. We've seen it historically over the past year where they've intervened, particularly with CFDs, where they think that there is a risk to retail consumers, and trying to restrict those products from retail consumers who, probably need advice or not appropriate for that product. And when we take a step back, when we look at the DDO, all we're talking about is that level of, paternalism, which again is consistent with the superannuation regime, is to give a level of consumer protection to those people who need it. Whether or not it's about the advice or the product itself, it's about just making sure that we put enough controls in place to try to minimise the risk of misconduct at whatever level. At the heart of this is, all we're saying here is, for those product issuers that have to issue product disclosure statements, or PDS, so those products that have a PDS will also have a TND. Now, the PDS, as you all know, that is the retail consumer protection document. It's a regulated document the issuer has to issue, which covers off the features, the risks, the consequences, the fees and charges associated with that product. And for every product that's subject to the regime, there's a PDS that's kept up to date, and the issuer has responsibility for the accuracy and the currency of that information. What the TMD is, the target market determination, complements that, but that TMD is not to be provided to a retail client. It's not something that needs to be given to a client that decides to invest via a platform or in a particular product. The TMD is largely for the benefit of the advisor. Because what it does, at least at a theoretical level, is gives you clarity about the types of clients that this is best for. Now, you can always make an informed decision to act outside those parameters if you're an advisor who provides retail financial product advice. That's fine, because you already got controls on you. But generally, the intention is to give the clear parameters to advisors, to distributors, about these are the types of products this product is good for, and obviously these are the types of products for whom this is the type of clients for whom this product is not good. Okay, so it's a clear way for advisors, whether they're general advice or personal advice, to be able to identify the appropriateness of that product for the client's circumstances. And I'll deal with that in a bit more detail when we look at the exemptions. So what it also requires is, the distributor, because what this Act does is it introduces the idea of financial product distribution. So we've spent a lot of time trying to move away from the idea that financial planners are product distributors, and we've created the idea they're advisors and whatever else. So in some respects, this is almost like a retrograde step, but they are trying to cover the broader market than financial planners. And so they're trying to cover off all those businesses and people that provide advice or product information through general advice models, factual information, or no advice models as well. Right? So it's broader than that. So the distributor's got to take reasonable steps to comply with the target market determination. So there's clearly, an obligation for the distributor, who could be the authorised rep or could be the licensee, to understand what the TMD requires and to take reasonable steps to comply. And I'll run through what reasonable steps mean. But one of those additional obligations is that as a distributor, you should be tracking, recording and escalating any complaints that come in about that product. So you can see how this can feed into the complaints regime as well, and also feed in potentially to the breaches. So I go back to that point about the Red October and all those changes and how they're all fitting together, because what you can see is this integrated approach to various data touch points to address the misconduct or consumer harm. So we're all part of that process now as well. And again, we'll see how that works. Now, what underpinned a lot of this change, and it doesn't surprise anyone here, is this series of product failures, but also one of the things that came through a lot of AFCA complaints and was echoed to a lesser degree in the Royal Commission, is this disconnect between how a product is promoted or recommended or positioned and what it actually does. And how do we address that type of issue? Now, you might say, well, that's the consumer's obligation, right? Buyer beware, caveat emptor, they should be able to make that decision. And that might be a reasonable position for execution-only models and maybe general advice models. But when you're providing personal advice, you've already got a whole range of legal and professional and moral duties, an obligation to act in the client's best interest, to consider their circumstances and whatever else. So from that perspective, you can't really rely on that. So how do we address it? Now, you would have seen over the past couple of years ASIC shifting their position on disclosure, recognising, as we've been saying for a long period of time, that disclosure doesn't work. Disclosure is a blunt instrument, and it doesn't address this issue about client understanding and engagement. But one of the great things we've seen over the past couple of years, ASIC are changing their position. They're now at the position where disclosure shouldn't be the default. It doesn't work for complex products or complex strategies, and it puts too much cognitive burden on consumers. And also then try and figure out, well, how do we if disclosure doesn't work, what do we do? Well, the focus or the answer is to focus on, I guess, engagement and understanding, and how do we simplify that message. And now, part of that will be the obligation of the product issues, of course, but a key part of that role and that education process rests with financial advisors like people on this call today. So how do we address it? Now, the DDO is trying, in a way, to try to bridge that gap between what a product promises and what it delivers. More transparency, but also a lot more clarity at an advisor level. Now, I remember going to an FPA event some years ago, and this was in the days when we were still dealing with the West Point failures and whatever else. And there was a panel of lawyers, and the lawyers were talking about the nature of the West Point product and whether or not it was a managed investment scheme, an unregistered managed investment scheme, or a mezzanine finance or something else. And each of the lawyers had a slightly different view of those issues. And what I found interesting was this: at one stage, one of the advisors put his hands up and he goes, "Look, you're all lawyers, you're sitting up on stage and you can't agree about the product." And he said, "All I did was sell it, and why is that my fault?" Now, that I didn't understand what the product was, right? You don't understand it, I didn't understand it, I sold it, what's the problem? And the problem is that there was an expectation on the advisors to do more than just sell a product, right? This is what we've been working on over the past at least 15 years, is trying to move away from this idea that we're the financial product distributors, that we're advisors. We're strategists, we're focusing on the client's needs and objectives, we're problem solvers. And this is what the regulation is also trying to do. And it might be a blunt instrument in some respects, but it is trying to marry the issuer's obligations to our aspirations for the advice business and for our role as advisors. And so it's a good thing. Where it isn't so good is the way in which it's been implemented and the way in which it's been interpreted by some of the participants. And we'll deal with that when we go through. But this is what drove it. So I imagine you can see these slides, and you can see here that what we're talking about here is this whole issue about the OPES Prime, how it all fits together, what it is. OPES Prime, we had Mayfair, we had Rundle, what else do we have? Great Southern. No matter how far you go back, and even a cursory examination of what's happening in the industry now and what's happened over the past couple of years, you can see a lot of product failures. Now, one of the problems we have with product failures in Australia is they inevitably land in the laps of the advisors. Now, sure, some advisors recommend them without understanding them, and they recommend them for the wrong reasons. And we saw with that, particularly with Great Southern, where the incentive regime for some of those products was seen to be the problem. And there was all that media attention about, advisors receiving 10,000 every time they made a recommendation. And there were a couple of cases which we can look at where accountants in particular committed clients to agri schemes in order to receive the benefits. And there's some quite obvious and egregious behaviour that was exposed in the courts. But again, what we're talking about here is just a series of issues that weren't appropriate for the people that invested in them. Because you might look at some of these things and go, well, if you're a wholesale investor, you're big enough and ugly enough to make this decision. You're in a position where you can assess risk and reward and make a decision. And you would have seen that Jane Hume came out today and was talking about, well, why the compensation scheme of last resort isn't going to apply to managed investment schemes. Because, she said, there's a relationship between risk and return, and it's not the government's role to try to get in the middle of that issue, despite the fact that that is what's been happening for a long period of time. The paternalistic nature, both of IDR and the regulation, puts the government in that position and tries to address that issue. What we're trying to do here is trying to get some type of balance, some type of informed engagement and understanding about what those obligations are, by ensuring that everyone involved in the process has an obligation to make sure things are done correctly. So from that perspective, it's not such a bad a bad way of approaching things. But it does recognise the fact that, you know, a lot of the things that we're dealing with here, a lot of these products, West Point was a good example, but any of the others, the Mayfair or the Oaks Prime or the Great Southern, all these issues are complex products, right? So the difficulty is, well, how do we deal with complex products? And again, I went to ASIC Summer School, and this was a number of years ago when they had representatives of, you know, the big broking houses up on stage, and they're talking about complex products. And their approach of complex products and how they thought they were appropriate and had an important part to play in a good portfolio or a well put together strategy. And they all had various, and we've seen over time there've been, you know, a range of products that came out of the Millionaire's Factory, which were, you know, capital protected products and with complex fee structures and a whole range of issues. So they were talking about these products, and someone put their hand up and said, okay, well, can you explain to me how your product works? And one of the talking heads on stage said, oh no, look, I can't explain that to you. It's too complicated for me. You'd have to speak to someone who knows more about it. And the person who said, but you're in charge of that product. You're the product head. Who do I get the explanation of the product from? And they said, oh, you'd speak to an advisor, and the advisor would explain it to you. And they said, but who explains it to the advisor? You know, there was a big gap in terms of products being developed, complex products, sophisticated products, bells and whistles, amazing products, and being dumped on advisors' laps. And we've seen that with some insurance products over the past couple of years as well, where they come out with some quite innovative issues, but they don't necessarily explain the consequences and implications of some of those product design choices. And what the change of law was trying to do is trying to figure out, well, if it's too complicated and people don't get it, consumers don't necessarily have the information, the knowledge, the understanding to be able to do that, how do we address that asymmetry? How do we do it? And again, this is why we've got the design and distribution obligations. So D&D applies to a whole range of financial products. Obviously, it doesn't apply to shares, right? So shares are out, there's no PDS for shares. We also exclude any MySuper products. Why? Because they're already highly regulated and controlled from that perspective, and they're not likely to be recommended. Closed products as well, you know, closed products, because there's no PDS, there's no TMD as well, so they're outside the regime. So a lot of the things we're talking about there, we're really talking about, you know, the standard financial products that are manufactured. So anything that's manufactured for a retail client, anything that's got a PDS will have a TMD and is part of the regime. And that's as simple as you need to think about from that perspective. It doesn't have to be more complicated from that perspective. So what are they trying to do when they've designed this regime? They're trying to cover all elements of it. So the product design, the product distribution, and the monitoring and review of those sectors as well. So what it's done, Part 7.8 of the Corporations Act has been amended. This whole new series of obligations are being pushed out. Now, how they've been responded to by the industry and how issuers have responded to these obligations is very different. And you would have seen this across the board, because I imagine you're dealing with some platform providers and some issuers who are quite relaxed about it, and others which have approached it in a way to try to increase the bureaucracy on you as well, right? And we've seen a lot of advice coming out of particularly like institutionally aligned support groups, which are sort of not only inconsistent with the letter of the law, but inconsistent with the intent of the law. And I want to cover off those as we go through that today as well. Again, you can ask questions as we go. I'm happy to address those things as well. Before we get to what your obligations are, just really take a step back and look at the issuer's obligations. So the issuer are the people who manufacture the products, issue them. They've got to prepare a target market determination. Now, I'm going to talk about and show some of those target market determinations. You would have seen them as well. There's a great difference in the quality and utility of those target market determinations. But again, they're not consumer documents, they're targeted at you. You know, it's an obligation on you to consider them. And this is where I want to be really clear as well, is that there are a lot of system providers and and other consultants who are talking about, well, how you're going to deal with the TMD and whatever else. Now, it is not required that every time you recommend product, you review the TMD. It's not required that you give the TMD to the client. Right? What ASIC are expecting and what we'd be expecting is that there's some type of evidence on file, or your process involves the consideration of the TMD in the same way that you consider research. So, for example, you'll periodically review product research. You won't necessarily do it for every recommendation because you're familiar with it, you're kept up to date, and it's part of your ongoing professional development to stay across it. So what we'd be looking for is just some recognition that you considered the TMD before you made the recommendation. We don't necessarily need the TMD to be on file. We don't necessarily need 700 pages of notes to that regard. We don't need the TMD attached to the SLA. We don't need those things. We just need evidence, and all the regulators are looking for is evidence that you've thought about it. You've considered the TMD before you've made that recommendation. And again, because you've got some exemption from those obligations, but fundamentally, there's an underlying obligation to at least have considered it, and that's all. The issuers have to make that TMD publicly available, right? So they should be posting it on their website. They should be making it available to you. They should be letting you know when the TMD has changed. Okay. There's also an obligation on them to make sure that their distribution is consistent with the TMD and that their distribution is appropriate. And this is one of the interesting aspects where I think some of the issuers have approached this really well, others are not. If I were an issuer and I was worried about the appropriateness of the distribution method, I would be asking questions of the distributor in terms of, well, how are you going to make sure your representatives understand the TMD, and how are you going to make sure that your representatives give recommendations that are consistent with the TMD? And when you identify issues, how are you going to escalate them and deal with them and all those bits and pieces? So some of the contracts that are coming out, we've seen the issuers are asking those questions and asking licensees to let us know about your governance framework. Tell us about your compliance ranges, how they work, how you're going to be dealing with these types of issues, because that's relevant to their decision. Others, they don't care. If you want to recommend the product and that's going to increase inflows or whatever else, then that's enough for us because it's all on you from that perspective. So some of them have approached it really well in a collaborative and cooperative manner, in a way that is consistent with the intent of the law and likely to improve things, and others have just seen it as a ticker box exercise that they need to get through. So we should see over time that start to change as ASIC start to make expectations clearer for those groups, but we'll wait and see how it happens. There's an obligation on the issuers to also notify ASIC about significant dealings which are inconsistent with the TMD. And I'll come back to this when I deal with the personal advice side of things. And that's essentially, from an issuer perspective, you can understand, issue a TMD, make it public, review it, make sure it remains appropriate, and consider how you're distributing your product as you go through that. But when we get to the distribution side, so like I said, licensees, and pretty much everyone on this call is a distributor. And so what are our obligations? Well, our obligations are to make sure that we don't distribute the product unless there is a TMD. And so this is where, at a basic level, at an APL level, we need to make sure that those products that fit within the design and distribution obligation regime have a TMD. If they don't have TMDs, well, we shouldn't be recommending them. So the first step you need to make at a licensee level is check your APL to make sure that there's nothing on there that lacks a TMD. At a licensee level, you also got to take reasonable steps, particularly if you're not providing personal advice. So if you're distributing products through general advice or factual information or execution only, for example, how do we deal with that and what are the reasonable steps we need to take? You've got to keep records, there's no surprise there. That's the perennial issue in financial services. You've also got to escalate to the distributors' complaints about their product. So you can see how the complaints piece and the DDO fits together and how potentially the breach one does as well. And of course, if there's a significant dealing which is inconsistent with the TMD, you've got to notify the product offerer, and the product offerer or the issuer will also have to notify ASIC. So you can see how there's this closed loop of information as we go through. So what are the reasonable steps you've got to take? Well, we don't need to concentrate too much on this, because I think most of the people on this webinar are running personal advice businesses, right? But assuming we're not relying on the personal advice exemption, what do we need? We need to essentially ensure that our compliance, risk and governance framework has enough controls in place to make sure that we've thought about how we manage these issues, how we promote documents, how we incentivize our advisors to recommend them, how we train them, how we deal with the TMDs at an advice level. I don't want to spend too much time on that, because I do think that's probably the least interesting, and a well-run business is doing that anyway, right? So you just need to make sure that you've considered those issues when you go through. And it's everything, most of your obligations, if not the vast majority, will always come back to this document, which is target market determination. Now, the target market determination is not a retail document. It's not a regulated document prepared for the purposes of being given to a retail client. It's not required to be provided to them by either the issuer or the distributor. But what it does do is it hopefully gives you as an advisor a short, sharp analysis of that product and for whom it is appropriate. And this is why when you look at the TMD, there's the key elements that need to be covered off. Well, what type of clients is this good for? What type of people should be investing in this product, and what type of clients shouldn't be? If there are conditions or restrictions on distribution, how does it all fit together, and how we deal with those types of issues? The TMD also has to say when it's going to be reviewed, because from your perspective, you need to know, well, this is going to expire at the end of the year. So by January next year, I need to get a new TMD, because I can't recommend or distribute a product unless there's a current TMD. So those dates are really important, in particular because you've got a statutory obligation to report complaints to the issuer within 10 days of the end of the review cycle. So you need to know when those review cycles end and when they occur. And I say that notwithstanding that some of the issuers are actually saying, well, we want to know whenever a complaint comes in. Now that's different to what the law is. I mean, they're pushing their luck maybe, but again, that's a choice you can make from that perspective as to how you want to respond to those types of issues. So the TMD, the problem with the TMD, and I'm sure you've seen this, is that some of the TMDs are really useful and some of them are completely impractical, that they don't really help you. So if you look at the target market determination for first choice, which is on the right, who is the target market good for? Who is this product designed for? Individuals want a super account. There is nothing in there that would have helped you or will help you make a better decision. Like if you don't know the first choice is a super platform, then you're going to be in very big trouble before you get to the point of the recommendation. The whole purpose of the TMD is to give you relevant information that helps you understand the product well. Now, when those disclosures or when the TMD is so broad, it really doesn't help you and it doesn't help the consumer as well. So you can look at the two approaches to it, and I'll show you another one later on. But some issuers have gone to the point of being really prescriptive, and that has its own problems. As you can imagine, if you get too prescriptive, it limits the usefulness and the utility of the document and the product to individuals. If you get too broad, for the same issues. So over time, I suspect these the issues will meet in the middle, and we'll get to a point where the TMDs will be useful and effective documents, but we're not there yet. At least not in my experience. If you've had other experiences, it'd be interesting to talk about them and see what happens. But I want to spend some time talking about some practical issues, and this is where, thankfully, you'll have the opportunity to talk about this. I use this particular example when I was dealing with breaches, but it's really interesting in some respects as well. So this is the example where we had an advisor who rebalanced a client portfolio on a platform. As a result of that rebalance of the model portfolio, there were shares sold. $370,000 of shares were sold. What happened? Well, this is where it comes down to the platform insists the advisor did it. The advisor has no recollection of it. Now, the problem is, like, when you look at this type of issue, and you could really drill down, depending on how you want to approach this, but in some respects, depending on how it comes in, the reason why this is interesting is for what? Why is this an interesting scenario? Or at least from my perspective, why have I used this as a scenario? Anyone got any ideas? You can unmute yourselves if you'd like to. Volunteer an answer. Okay, what's interesting here is, depending on how this is presented, is that it falls within a complaint about the product, a complaint about the platform itself. I know the platform's insisting that the advisor did it, but there's no evidence that happened. If a client lodges a complaint about that 307, which is any expression of dissatisfaction, it becomes a complaint, and it becomes a product complaint, theoretically. And so this is where this nexus between these types of things work in. It's not distinctly an issue about, the appropriateness of the platform or the target market determination, but it is a DDO issue insofar as there's a product complaint that's relevant to the design of the product. Now, how you decide to approach this can be relevant, because you could also look at the issues about, well, recent increases in premiums for some of the insurance product, is that an appropriateness issue doesn't fall within that. So this is one of those ones where you look at it and you've got to think about, in context, is it a DDO issue, or can it be a DDO issue? It certainly can be. I wouldn't say first and foremost the immediate response would be, it's a product failure and part of the regime. But depending on where the complaint comes from, depending on how it's phrased, it could be a DDO issue. So you've got to be aware of those broader issues, particularly when you've got an obligation to report it and you've got an obligation to report it quickly. There's scenario 2, and this is one we see all the time as well. So scenario 2, so let's presume you've got a model portfolio. You've got a conservative model portfolio, and part of your conservative model portfolio has an 8% allocation to the perpetual wholesale geared Australian share fund. And I'll put the APR code on there so you can look it up as we're talking. Is this a DDO issue? Is this a problem from a DDO perspective? Well, depending on which group of advisors you speak to and which institutional licensee you speak to, some of them would say, yeah, that's definitely a DDO issue. I mean, the perpetual wholesale geared fund is not appropriate for consumers that can't deal with capital loss. It's not appropriate. Therefore, for a conservative model portfolio, it's not appropriate. The clients don't fit that, and so it's a DDO issue, and it should be recorded and it should be reported. And I can understand that view, but it is completely wrong. One of the things to look at when you're looking at the target market determination and the appropriateness is it's got to be assessed in context. So sure, okay, so the wholesale geared Australian share fund, it's not high risk, but it's a long-term issue. There are risks there. It's there are going to be the risks of capital loss and everything that go with it, right? So it's not generally suited for someone who can't bear any loss. But we're not talking about 100% allocation in the fund. We're talking about a minuscule, immaterial, depending on how you've done it under your APL and the research policy, an immaterial allocation to a fund. Now, that does not necessarily create a DDO issue. And this is one of the things to make sure you're confident about, because there is a lot of miscommunication about that. It's not an absolute, particularly if you're providing financial product advice to retail clients and you're providing personal advice. There's a whole range of exemptions, and those exemptions are based on the fact that you already have a legal obligation to act efficiently, honestly and fairly, and even obligation to act in the client's best interest. So it's not a DDO issue from that perspective. You don't need to worry about it. And this is what I really like about the way Perpetual's put it together. Because if you look at their description of the target market, what they do is they say, look, if you're putting 100% into it, well, no, it's not considered right. It's not right. But depending on the level of diversification you want, then it may be in the target market and whatever else. And I think that's a really useful way to approach things. And at a licensee level, you should be thinking about the same type of things. About where we put our model portfolios together, of course, we're going to blend and diversify. That's the whole point of them. And even in conservative portfolio, we're going to have some exposure to growth assets so that we can deliver returns. This is another one that's I think is interesting from that perspective. A client comes in, I've used a long-standing client in this circumstance. She wants to put $100,000 into a fund she's heard about, high growth fund or whatever it is. You know it's not on your APL, you don't know anything about it, but you do it on an execution-only basis. Thumbs up, thumbs down? Any indication from that perspective? One of the issues you've got here is, okay, if I was providing personal advice, then my bid and client priority would govern the way I approach this and there wouldn't be an issue. But I haven't. I've done it as execution only. So what that means is at a licensee level, I've got to have reasonable steps in place to make sure that I haven't distributed an inappropriate product to Kelly. And so this is where, when you're doing execution only, where you're doing general advice, your obligations are obviously greater than if you're providing personal advice, because I've got to put structures in place to make sure that happens. So if you do any type of execution only advice in your business or execution only services, you've got to think about, well, what steps are we going to put in? What measures, processes and procedures are we going to put in place to make sure that we're not distributing products in a manner inconsistent with the TMD? Okay, so the obligation is actually greater when you're providing execution only or general advice. And that's one thing that's often missed by some groups as well. I don't want to spend too much time on the penalties in particular. We know there are penalties involved. I do want to emphasise that ASIC have announced they will take a facilitative approach to these obligations. They understand there's a lot of change going on at the moment. And so they're being quite commercial and reasonable about it, but they do expect you to have stuff in place. So look at the way in which you're approaching the design and distribution obligations. They're tangential to good advice businesses because, again, you're already acting in the client's best interest, you're already prioritising their interests, you're already issuing appropriate advice. So the TMD is just a bureaucratic road bump for most of you, but you do have to make sure that you've got appropriate structures in place. If you do have questions about this or any of the other issues we've talked about in terms of the October reforms, drop us a line, send us an email. We're happy to help you out from that perspective. What I would suggest is, if you haven't already done it, have a look at your APL. Make sure you've gone through your APL and you've confirmed that there are TMDs, and think about how you're going to manage that on a basis, because you're not going to necessarily want to make an obligation over advisor to review every TMD every time they make a recommendation. What you might do is you might break your APL up, link the TMDs to the APL, communicate it to your advisors, maybe quarterly, get an attestation from them that they're aware of the TMDs, and that protects the licensee. It's a way of just managing that process. From your monitoring and supervision, though, you've got to be able to check, well, are they actually doing stuff? And this is where it comes down to the directions you give your advisors about what we expect you to do with the TMD. Do I have to look at it every time? Do I have to consider it? If I've considered it, well, how do I document that? And again, from that consideration, if you've used the attestation model and there's a file note, well, then that's adequate, reasonable steps, and it works together. So that's it from that perspective. Are there any questions in terms of DDO? Does anyone want to put their hand up and ask any questions before we sign off? Okay. Well, I'd like to thank you all for your concentration this morning. I know it's a big ask. DDO is in particular quite a bureaucratic process from that perspective, and it's a lot of cost and inconvenience for something which has marginal utility for good advisors and good advice practices. But again, a number of ways in which we do it. We've got a lot of the controls within OpenAFSL itself. to help do that. And certainly our monitoring and supervision and the advice assurance process already considers those things. So if there are no further questions and we're all happy, then I think what we might do is just call it a day, and thank you for your attention. Have a great day, everybody.